Hey, friends, tonight's story was written just for you, using history, imagination to help you relax. Part 1, The Empty Table. Hi. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 64 years old, and this is the story of how my birthday turned into a quiet kind of storm I never saw coming. I'd spent the morning setting the table like I used to, white linen, real silverware. The ceramic bowls that only came out when something mattered. It was my 65th. A quiet milestone. No dancing, no speeches. Just my family. Or so I thought. I had called them, texted them, reminded them. And each one had said the same thing. Of course, we'll be there. So I baked the roast chicken with rosemary. I made the lemon tart my grandson used to steal from the fridge before dinner. I put out place cards. 11. One for each person who made me believe I hadn't grown old alone. The chairs stayed empty. The food cooled. And the only sound was the slow tick of the clock above the sink. By sunset, I was still sitting there, in my best dress, with my hands folded on the table like I was waiting for a verdict. And then my phone buzzed. It was a photo from my daughter-in-law. A beach. A cocktail. The caption read, "Much needed escape. Sorry we missed it." That was it. No name. No heart emoji. Just that. And something in me, something I hadn't felt in decades, cracked open just enough to let the silence speak louder than ever. But no. The date was right. And I hadn't forgotten anything. I just wasn't remembered. I stood there staring at that glowing table, the flickering candles throwing soft shadows across empty chairs. One by one, I blew each one out, not for a wish, but because I couldn't bear how hopeful they looked. I poured myself a glass of wine, toasted the silence, and tried to pretend the food didn't taste like salt from my own tears. Then, just as I started to clear the plates, thinking maybe I'd imagined they ever loved me at all, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't any of my kids. It was Laura. My daughter-in-law. Standing there in a sleek coat, heels clicking against the porch, phone in one hand and a look I couldn't read in the other. "Hey, Margaret," she said, like she didn't just forget my entire birthday. "I need a favor." No hello. No sorry. Not even a hug. Just a favor. She walked in like she owned the place and sat down at the table I had so lovingly prepared. "Mind if I eat?" she asked, and before I could answer, she was already serving herself the last piece of lemon tart. I watched her chew, her mouth full of everything I made with care. "This is good," she said. "You always go all out." Then she looked at me and said, "I know no one showed up. I told them not to." And that's when I knew this story wasn't just about a birthday. It was the beginning of something else entirely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the same chair where I'd waited with the roast, now cold and sliced open like the truth, and I kept flipping through those papers. Deeds. Transfer forms. Letters from my husband I'd forgotten he wrote. There was one from 1993, written in his sharp, lawyer-perfect hand, where he said, "If they ever stop seeing your worth, remember, we built this life together, and most of it is still in your name." I stared at that sentence for so long I thought I might go blind. Then I started writing. Not out of spite, not yet, but out of something deeper. Precision. I listed the main house. The cabin in Maine. The stocks under my maiden name. The safe deposit keys. I even dug out the jewelry appraisals. I knew what they'd assumed, that after he passed, I'd just roll over, let them take control, nod along like some doddering old woman. But what they didn't know was that when I was 27, I was the one who found the first buyer for our law firm's building. When I was 32, I sat through contract negotiations with men who thought I was the secretary. When I was 40, I quietly shifted half our assets into trusts with my initials on them. And now, at 65, I wasn't scared of being alone. I was scared of what I might become if I kept letting them treat me like background noise. So, That morning, with the candles melted into lumps and the leftovers in the trash, I got dressed in navy slacks and my old court blouse, walked into town, and visited the office of Mr. Delgado, our old accountant. He almost dropped his coffee when he saw me. I said, "Let's update some files." He smiled and said, "About time." We worked for 3 hours. By the time I left, my name was restored to places it never should have left. I went home, poured myself a small glass of wine, and stared at my phone. There was a message from my son, just a thumbs up emoji under a forwarded meme. No apology. No mention of the dinner. Just another sign that I'd been turned into a footnote in my own family. I didn't cry. I didn't reply. I opened my calendar and circled a date, the first Saturday of next month. That's when I'd make my first move. Not a warning. Not a threat. Just a small shift. A recalibration. I wasn't going to burn bridges. I was going to raise the drawbridge and let them knock. Let's see how long it takes before they realize the locks have changed. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept going. Over the faces, the laughter, the wine glasses clinking in someone else's kitchen while mine stayed quiet and cold. The cake I baked still sat untouched on the counter, its frosting slowly crusting over. At 3 a.m., I finally picked up my phone. I didn't text or call anyone, I just opened the gallery and stared at the old pictures. My son, age 6, in the backyard with a soccer ball. My daughter-in-law, before she even became family, smiling shyly beside me at a barbecue. All those memories that felt borrowed now. I whispered to myself, they forgot who I am. No, worse, they stopped caring. The next morning, I cleaned everything. Not just the dishes and the table, but the boxes. I went up to the attic and pulled down things I hadn't looked at in years. Letters, toys, old sweaters. And then, under a stack of yellowed photo albums, I found it, a small wooden box. No lock, no key. Just a lid that creaked when I opened it. Inside were a few notes, some from my late husband, others from my children when they were small. But there was one folded paper I didn't recognize. It had no name, just a date and a list, my name, an address, and something about a trust. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just an old scrap. It was a legal document. From a lawyer. From years ago. From a time I barely remembered, because I had been too busy cooking dinners, ironing shirts, and being a mom to notice. I sat down, reread it twice, then grabbed my purse. I walked into town, yes, in my good shoes, the ones I saved for church, and I went to that lawyer's office. The man behind the desk had a gray beard and eyes that lit up when I gave him the paper. "We've been waiting for you to claim this," he said gently. "For over 20 years. I blinked. "Claim what?" And he smiled. "Your share. Your husband's legacy. He left it for you alone." I stared, stunned. "But I never saw this before." He handed me a folder. Inside was the amount. A number I could barely comprehend. "He made sure you'd be taken care of, once you remembered you had your own life, separate from theirs." I walked out of that office not just with the folder, but with a new spine. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I booked a vacation. Just for me. First class. Beachfront. No family. No apologies. Just peace. And when my son called late, sheepish, to ask how my birthday dinner went, I simply said, "Oh, I had cake. I had wine. I had a moment of clarity. How about you?" That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, in the same chair I had pulled out for my son, my daughter-in-law, and even the grandchildren. The table still looked like a spread from a magazine, soft candlelight, carefully folded linen napkins, little handwritten name cards. But now, it felt like a museum of delusion, a space arranged with hope, and abandoned by everyone it was meant for. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw anything. I just stared at the chair across from me. I had placed a tiny porcelain angel beside Lily's plate, the one she used to love when she was little. It was still there. Untouched. Like me. Around 10 o'clock, I started clearing. Slowly. Methodically. I wrapped each untouched plate of food. As if preserving evidence for some future trial that would never happen. I put Lily's untouched gift bag back in the cabinet. I turned off the music, something classical and hopeful, and the silence that followed was louder than any argument I'd ever had. I thought maybe I'd dream it differently. That. In sleep, my brain would paint a version where the door had opened, someone laughed, someone hugged me too tight and said, "Sorry we're late." But even in sleep, the house felt empty. The next morning, I checked my phone, even though I had turned off the ringer hours ago. Nothing. Not a missed call, not a text. Just a promotional email for discounted burial plots and a forwarded chain letter from a neighbor I barely knew. I stared at the living room, still clean, still waiting. And then I saw something that hadn't registered last night, the envelope. It was tucked beneath the flower arrangement, angled like it had been dropped accidentally. I hadn't noticed it before. My name was written in my daughter-in-law's sharp handwriting. I held my breath as I opened it. There was no card, no apology, just a printout of a Facebook post. It was from Lily's account. A group photo at a rooftop bar, everyone dressed up, raising glasses, smiling. The caption read, "Family is. Who shows up? Cheers to starting our own traditions." My hands didn't shake. I didn't crumble. I simply folded the paper back into the envelope, walked to the trash, and placed it in, carefully, like something contaminated. The house no longer felt empty. It felt mine. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something I didn't even know I needed. Thank you for watching first part of this original story, but this was just the beginning. In part 2, something unexpected shifts. A voice from the past returns. A door Margaret thought was closed forever, creaks open. Part 2, the message she didn't expect. I stood at the sink that morning, rinsing the empty glasses from last night, or rather, from what should have been last night. The dishes were spotless, untouched. Just like the wine bottles. Just like the chairs. It was as though the party never existed, except it had, in my mind, in my heart, in every hour I spent planning it. I'd even picked out the music. Made a playlist with everyone's favorite songs. A little jazz for Peter, my son-in-law. Some silly pop for Chloe, my granddaughter. Even an old Sinatra tune that used to make my late husband laugh. But none of it played. The speakers stayed silent. So did my phone. I double-checked the group message I'd sent 3 days ago. Yes, it was there. Sunday at 5. Come hungry. Come happy. Come home. Nothing fancy. Just me, hoping they'd want to come. They didn't. The only sound in the house was the ticking of the wall clock and the creak of the floor beneath my feet. Then I heard the rustle of paper. It came from the front door. I walked over, confused. And there it was. A note. Folded twice and slipped through the mail slot like something secret. No envelope. Just handwriting I didn't recognize. And yet. I did. My heart skipped. I opened it slowly. Margaret, I saw your text. I'm sorry they didn't come. I would've, if I could. Don't clean anything up. Wait for me. L. Just that. No full name. But I knew who it was. Or at least I thought I did. The way the M curled, the way the ink smudged a little at the corners, it reminded me of something. Someone I hadn't seen in over 20 years. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around, half expecting to see a figure down the street. But there was no one. Just the note. Just that quiet. I didn't clean anything up. I waited. Not out of desperation, I wasn't that woman anymore, but out of something else. A whisper in my bones. A part of me that still believed in showing up. I lit one candle. Sat at the head of the table. Watched the shadows move. And when the clock struck 6, a knock came at the door. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was crying, no. I had done enough of that in previous years. But something shifted after the silence of my birthday, something I didn't know. Had been waiting to wake up. I sat by the window with my robe wrapped tight and watched the streetlights flicker on the wet pavement, thinking about all the little moments I'd let slide. All the dinners where I smiled through being ignored. All the holidays where I cooked and cleaned while they sat scrolling their phones or whispered in corners. All the times they said I was lucky to have them, as though I should be grateful just to exist in their orbit. And what stung more than anything? I had believed it. Bit by bit, I'd let their neglect shrink me down, make me feel like asking for respect was asking too much. But not anymore. That morning, I made coffee, strong and bitter, just how I used to before I learned to water things down for everyone else, and I pulled out my notebook. Not the to-do list one. The thick leather-bound one I'd received as a retirement gift but never dared to use. I wrote one sentence: this year, I will not be invisible. And then I made my first call. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't yell. I didn't say, "How dare you not come to my party?" I simply called my son. And said, "We need to talk." His pause told me everything, not surprise, not guilt, but inconvenience. Like I had disrupted his schedule. "Is everything okay?" he asked, already annoyed. "Not really," I replied. "But it will be." I didn't wait for him to answer. I hung up. I spent the rest of the day planning. Not revenge. Not theatrics. Just reclaiming. My garden, long overgrown, got trimmed that afternoon. I called a contractor to fix the back porch they always said they'd get around to. I booked a photo shoot. Yes, a photo shoot. For me. Not for an obituary. Not for someone else's wedding slideshow. For me. The woman they had slowly erased would now be in full color, sharp, clear, undeniable. And as I folded the last towel and placed it on the shelf, towels no one else had touched in weeks, I whispered, almost with a smile, "You don't get to forget me anymore." I watched them through the kitchen window, the way they all leaned in over their wine glasses, laughing at some joke I'd clearly never been part of. The same faces who once cried at my table, called me their second mother, who used to ask me for recipes and advice and childhood stories of their husbands, now barely glanced my way unless it was with a smirk or a polite nod. But that evening, I wasn't going to chase after attention. I finished washing the last dish, wiped my hands on the towel I'd sewn myself when I was barely 20, and sat down by the phone. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to. I simply listened. To the way the house sounded when it wasn't full of voices pretending to care. I could hear the old wind chimes outside, faint hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking like it always did when no one was talking over it. And I felt something settle inside me. Not sadness, not quite. More like clarity. Like I could finally see the lines that had always been there between us. The ones I ignored when I babysat there. Kids for free. When I cooked for gatherings I was barely thanked for. When I kept secrets that weren't mine to hold. That night, when I finally walked into the dining room, I didn't say a word. I just stood there. They didn't even notice at first. But when they did, when Michael glanced up and his smile faltered, when Linda set her fork down like she'd been caught, I nodded once. Calm. Then turned and walked upstairs. I packed my bags without hurry. I folded the dresses they never noticed, slipped a photograph of my husband into the outer pocket, and left the envelope I'd written weeks ago on the kitchen table. Inside it, a single line: "I won't be here to clean up your messes anymore." The next morning, I checked into a quiet hotel 2 towns over. It wasn't fancy. But the bed was soft, the manager called me ma'am with a real smile, and when I opened the curtains, I saw mountains instead of a driveway full of strangers. I turned off my phone. Bought a paperback novel from a thrift store. And for the first time in what felt like decades, I read without checking the clock. No one knew where I was. And for once, that didn't scare me, it thrilled me. Because maybe, just maybe, I was finally living for myself. Damn, my hands didn't shake when I turned off the lights that night, but my mind ran through every little detail: who hadn't shown up, what excuses they gave, what glances were exchanged across the table. The same daughter-in-law who once said she couldn't make time to help with groceries had posted a photo of her manicure that same afternoon. The same grandson who claimed he had an exam had been tagged at a rooftop party. I didn't confront them. I didn't even comment. But I began to remember things. Patterns. A decade ago, when my hip surgery left me unable to walk for weeks, they sent flowers but never visited. 5 years ago, when I hosted Thanksgiving and burned the turkey, they joked about it for months, but not once asked if I was okay. It wasn't just the birthday. It had been building, quietly, over time, like water rising behind a dam. I thought about the times I bit my tongue to keep peace. About the gifts I'd bought, the babysitting, the silent sacrifices. And I thought about Margaret Hale, the woman I used to be. A teacher for 37 years. A woman who managed classrooms of rowdy teenagers, who ran community drives, who kept the family calendar organized and the holidays humming like a well-oiled machine. That woman had slowly become a just grandma, a background figure expected to appear, smile, serve, and disappear. But not anymore. That night, I pulled out the family trust documents I hadn't looked at in a decade. I took out my pen and made notes in the margins. I opened a new folder on my computer, Plan B. Just in case. I wrote down names of people who'd shown up in my life without obligation: my old colleague Janet, the boy from next door who shovels my driveway without being asked, the hospice volunteer who visits twice a month and sits with me just to talk. Maybe it was time to rewrite more than my will. Maybe it was time to rewrite how I lived these next years. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning recognition, for those who cared without expecting anything in return. For those who made me feel seen. I went to sleep not bitter, but clear. The silence from my family didn't hurt anymore. It just told me where not to look. For warmth. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt focused. Awake. Ready. Thank you for watching part 2 of Margaret's story. In this chapter, we saw a woman reclaim her dignity, step by step, but someone from her past is about to return. And not empty-handed. Part 3 will change everything. Don't miss it. Part 3, the invitation no one expected. I didn't sleep much after that night. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The silence in the house felt thicker than ever, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting for someone to break. I walked past the photos. In the hallway, all those smiling faces, all those moments that were supposed to mean something. And yet, when it mattered, they couldn't give me a single one of those smiles. I started writing everything down. Not just the words they used, but the pauses between them, the way their eyes darted, the way they avoided each other. I knew something was off. The way my daughter-in-law had reacted to the mention of my old garden bench, the one that vanished during renovations, it stuck with me. I couldn't let it go. So I went down to the basement, pulled out the dusty photo boxes, and started digging. It took me hours, but I found it, a picture from the summer of '94, all of us in the yard. And there, in the background, half hidden under ivy, was the original bench. Same design. Same crack in the wood. Only now, the one in their yard was painted, cleaned, and called a custom vintage piece on their renovation blog. I laughed. Not out of humor, but because it confirmed everything. They weren't just ignoring me. They were slowly erasing me. My things, my stories, my presence, repurposed into something shinier, trendier, more presentable to the world. But I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I started planning. Quietly. Deliberately. I changed my will that week. Took a long walk through my investments, my properties, my little safety nets they didn't know about. I wrote a list of names, people who had shown up when I needed them, even once, even briefly. I wrote letters. Sealed envelopes. Gave one to a lawyer I trusted since before any of them knew how to spell inheritance. Then I called the community center. Signed up for a class. Took a new photo. I was done waiting for them to remember me. It was time they noticed what happens when the person they wrote off stops playing along the SO. When I walked into that quiet cafe the next morning, I didn't expect to see my grandson sitting there, alone, head low, stirring his drink like he was ashamed of something. I hadn't even told anyone where I'd be. He looked up, saw me, and his face just cracked. He stood up fast, knocking over the chair, and came straight to me, arms wide like he was 6 again. No words, just that hug, long, desperate, trembling. I hadn't felt like someone's anchor in years, but in that moment, I was. He whispered, "I'm sorry," again and again, and I realized he thought this mess was his fault. I made him sit, ordered us tea, and just let him talk. He told me how he overheard his mother, my daughter-in-law, saying she was done with the old lady guilt-tripping everyone into obligations, how the rest of them had laughed, agreeing they deserved a break from my pity parties. He'd begged to come, but she'd told him she'd take away his soccer if he even texted me. He'd kept quiet, until now. My heart didn't break. It turned to ice. I didn't cry, not in front of him. I just listened. And after he finished, I took a breath and told him, very calmly, "Sweetheart, I think it's time we made our own plans, you and I. Just you and me." And the way his face lit up, it warmed something in me that had been cold for years. I walked out of that cafe with a list of schools he liked, places he wanted to visit, books he was reading. And later that night, I made 2 calls, one to a lawyer, and one to a real estate agent. If they wanted distance, I'd give them oceans. But not before I made sure they knew, everything they took for granted was about to slip through their fingers like sand. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind was whirring, not with sadness, but with clarity. I kept hearing their voices in my head, not just what my grandson told me, but every moment over the past few years that I'd brushed off. Every "you'll be fine" when I hinted at loneliness. Every missed call. Every dinner they skipped with a casual "next time." There'd never be a next time. Not for them. The lawyer was kind, efficient. We rewrote the will from top to bottom. Every vague clause was clarified, every loophole sealed. My grandson would have his future secured, not out of spite, but because he had heart, and that mattered. The rest? They could keep their distance. They'd build that wall themselves. The real estate agent was faster than I expected. We found a cottage by the sea, 2 bedrooms, a porch with room for books and tea, and the sound of gulls instead of gossip. I told no one. Packed in silence. My grandson helped on weekends, under the guise of volunteering for school. His mother never asked questions. Maybe she didn't care, or maybe she thought I was finally fading. Either way, she'd be surprised. On my last morning in the house, I left behind a box on the dining table. Inside, every photo, every card I'd ever received from them, neatly labeled, organized, and placed under a note that simply said, "You taught me what matters by showing me what doesn't." Then I locked the door one last time and drove away. My grandson met me at the new house a week later. We painted the walls ourselves, laughed when the porch swing collapsed under our weight, and made a list of everything we wanted to do that summer. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for calls, visits, permission to matter. I mattered. Right there. With someone who saw me, chose me. And the silence from the others? It was no longer empty. It was peace. The first letter arrived 2 weeks later. Handwritten, formal, clearly not meant to sound like an apology. It was from my daughter-in-law, asking if I had left something behind, wondering if I'd have forgotten to say goodbye properly, as if I owed her a curtain call. I didn't reply. A few days later came a voicemail from my son, hesitant. Drawn out, like someone trying to find the right tone to open a door they'd bolted shut. He didn't say sorry either. Just asked where I was, said the kids missed me. I knew better. Only one of those kids ever really saw me, and he was sitting next to me that night, helping me make peach cobbler from a recipe I thought I'd lost. Then the messages changed. Sharper. More demanding. We need to talk. You can't just vanish. There's been a misunderstanding. I played them all once, saved none. Because this wasn't about misunderstanding, it was about being seen, or never being seen at all. I went through old boxes, found photos where I wasn't even in the frame, just the one taking it. Cards signed without a single handwritten note. Gifts I never asked for, smiles that never reached their eyes. It wasn't hate. That's too strong a word. It was dismissal, indifference, the quiet erosion of love into obligation. But in my new home, I watched the tide roll in every morning. And roll back every night, constant, honest, unbothered by who appreciated it. That's what I became. Steady, sure, unmoved by the noise that once dictated my worth. I hosted dinners just for us, my grandson and I, set 2 places, lit candles, laughed like I hadn't in years. And as the wind pressed against the windows each night, I whispered thanks to the silence. It was never cruelty that hurt the most. It was being overlooked by the very people I gave my years to. But not anymore. Now, I wasn't overlooked. I had a view of the sea, a seat at my own table, and someone who hugged me without needing a reason. And I knew, in every quiet breath, this was not the ending. This was the part where I finally began. That was the end of part 3. And if you've been following this far, you already know, Margaret is not someone you quietly dismiss. That hug in the cafe? That wasn't a sweet moment. That was a warning shot. The ice is cracking, and the ripples are spreading. Part 4 is where the quiet woman they underestimated becomes the one writing the rules, not with rage, but with precision. Get ready, part 4, rest can be dangerous when it wakes up what they buried. The hardest part wasn't cutting them off, it was pretending like they were never part of me. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want them to cry, or apologize, or even see me thriving. I just wanted peace. But peace has a price, especially when people like them believe they still own a piece of you. The day the papers were signed, full transfer of property, financial separation, and legal notices sent to every family member who thought I was still available, I exhaled for the first time in months. I donated the vacation house, liquidated the trust my husband set up for future grandkids, and sent every penny to organizations that actually made a difference. Quietly. No announcements. No grand gestures. Just clean exits. But freedom made space for something else, too, the movement. I joined a book club, of all things. Then a walking group. I even took a short trip to the coast and stood barefoot on the sand at sunrise, realizing I'd spent most of my life making sure others felt warm while I froze. That week, I bought a journal. Not to keep a record, but to remember who I was before I became grandma, mom, wife, provider. I started writing my real name on things again. Margaret. Not Maggie, not Nana, not Mom. Just Margaret. One afternoon, while reorganizing old boxes, I found a postcard I never mailed, one I wrote to myself after turning 40, when I'd wanted to take a solo train trip across the country but canceled because the kids had school projects and my husband needed a suit altered. The message was short: don't forget what the sky looks like when you're not looking down. I pinned it to the mirror in my bedroom. And then I booked that train trip, 30 years late, but finally mine. The funny thing about starting over at 65 is that people assume you're too tired to change. But I wasn't tired, I was just finally rested. And rest can be dangerous when it wakes up all the parts of you that others tried to bury. That week passed in quiet coordination. I didn't storm out or slam doors. I didn't even cancel the weekly family brunch, I simply stopped hosting it. Let them wonder. Let them wait. Meanwhile, I met with the lawyer, a kind woman in her 40s who didn't ask many questions once I showed her the documents I still had access to, the ones they thought I'd forgotten about, or assumed. I couldn't understand. I smiled as I slid the papers across the table, the property deeds, the joint accounts they never bothered to unlink, the original trust details that were never amended. It's all legal, I said softly. I just want it restructured. Quietly. The lawyer's brow arched, but she didn't argue. Then came the meetings with the real estate agent. I didn't need luxury, I needed freedom. A small cottage near the coast, near a good school for my grandson, near nothing else that would remind me of what I was leaving behind. The view was wide and open. I could breathe there. While the process moved along, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to a bookstore. Not the big chain ones, but the dusty little one tucked behind the bakery downtown. The same one my late husband used to bring me to. The bell over the door still jingled the same way. The man behind the counter hadn't changed either. He looked up and grinned, as if I were a regular. "You look like someone who needs fiction today," he said, and I laughed. He handed me a novel I'd read 30 years ago and forgotten. I bought it anyway. That night, my grandson called, not his mother, not my son, just him. He asked if he could come by after school. No one had ever asked me that before. They used to just arrive. I told him I'd be honored. And when he came, with his little backpack and messy hair, he brought something I didn't expect. A drawing. It was a picture of me. Not how I saw myself in the mirror, tired and gray, but how he saw me. Smiling. Strong. Standing next to a tree with deep roots and open arms. He said, "This is where we're going to live. With trees. And quiet. And pancakes on Sundays." I didn't cry. But I did sit with him on the floor for hours, planning what we'd pack and what we'd leave behind. Some people never realize they're building cages until they see the door swing open. Mine had rusted hinges, but it still opened. And I was already halfway through. The day the papers were finalized, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel relief. Just a quiet click inside me, like the last lock on a door I'd been closing for years. I'd signed over the house to a charity that helps elderly women escape neglect and isolation. The woman from the agency teared up when I handed her the keys. "You could have sold this for so much more," she said. I just smiled and told her it wasn't about the money. It never had been. Not for me. I walked out of that house in flats and a linen coat, carrying only one bag. Inside were letters, real ones, handwritten and folded, from women who'd seen the article in the local paper. I'd shared a small piece of what happened. Not for attention, but to explain why I was funding the charity. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of women wrote back. Some just to say they understood. Some to tell me I wasn't alone. One woman said she'd been afraid to tell anyone how her son's wife kept her from seeing the grandkids. Another said she'd thrown her own birthday party and ended up eating cake alone in her car. I read every word, every name, every pain. And then I started writing back. Not online. Not with some glossy message. But with pen and paper, each letter folded. With care, each one an anchor thrown into someone else's storm. It became my ritual. Morning tea, soft sunlight, and a fresh envelope. I wasn't trying to fix anyone. I just wanted them to know they weren't invisible. And in doing that, I realized, neither was I. I'd spent so many years trying not to make trouble, not to be a burden, that I'd disappeared into the wallpaper of my own life. But now, with every letter, every story I heard, I felt more solid. More real. I wasn't anyone's afterthought anymore. I was the beginning of something. Nude. I didn't expect to feel so calm when the call finally came. "They've arrived," the lawyer said, her voice clipped, professional. "All parties are seated." I was already walking out the door before she hung up. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times, but nothing could compare to watching their faces when I walked into that office, not timid, not fragile, not broken. My son looked startled, his wife shifted uncomfortably, and my daughter, well, she didn't meet my eyes. I sat down slowly, placed the folder in front of me, and said nothing. I didn't have to. The lawyer began, outlining the terms: the transfer of property, the cessation of financial support, the sale of the lake house, and the decision to revise the trust in favor of my grandson. I watched it land, one word at a time. My son leaned forward, voice tight. "What is this?" I turned to him, finally speaking. "This is what happens when you treat family like furniture, something to ignore until it's useful again." My daughter-in-law snapped, "You're being cruel." I almost laughed. "No. I'm being clear." My daughter whispered, "But why now?" And I replied, "Because I finally stopped hoping you'd come back." The silence that followed was delicious. I stood, slow and steady, leaving the folder behind. This meeting is just a formality. Everything's already been filed. And then I left, heels clicking, heart racing but steady. That night, I made my grandson his favorite dinner, and we sat at the kitchen table planning our trip for spring break. I told him about the house by the coast I was buying, with the study he could turn into a library. He asked, "Will I live with you full-time?" And I said, "Only if you want to." He whispered, "I do." I knew it would be messy, the court proceedings, the questions, the guilt. But for once, I was ready. They made their choices. And now, I was finally making mine. And I would no longer apologize for choosing peace over blood. If they thought age made her weaker, they were about to learn how wrong they were. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. And by the time they realized it, their place in her story had already been rewritten. Part 5, The Final Invitation. They thought they'd cut me out, but I was the one holding the scissors. Under the soft hum of a dim kitchen light, I sat at my old wooden table, the same one that had held every birthday cake, every spilled glass of wine, every tearful holiday toast. I stared at the printed guest list I'd rewritten at least 10 times. Not a single name from the original family tree remained. Instead, it was filled with people who had actually shown up: the librarian who helped me print documents when my home computer died, the young woman from the pharmacy who remembered my name and asked about my arthritis. Even the delivery boy who once waited in the rain just to make sure I got my groceries. They were the ones who smiled without expectation, who spoke to me like I mattered. They were the ones I invited. Not my son. Not his wife. Not my daughter, who hadn't called in months. And certainly not the ones who sat in a group chat laughing at the old woman who used to bake them pies from scratch. The new guest list was for something simple: a brunch in the garden. My garden. With tablecloths I stitched myself, lemon water with fresh mint, and music from a small Bluetooth speaker someone had gifted me last Christmas. No balloons. No Happy 66th banners. Just warmth. And when the morning arrived, the sun didn't just shine, it lingered, like it was staying for tea. They all came, my new guests, bringing flowers from their yards, stories from their week, and one woman even brought a painting she'd done of an iris because I once told her I loved that flower. I looked around that table and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to earn anyone's time. They were there because they wanted to be. I didn't cry until later, after the dishes were done and the last guest hugged me goodbye. It wasn't sadness, it was release. I had finally, quietly, chosen myself. And I hadn't done it with drama or confrontation. I did it with a guest list that he said he just wanted to see me happy, that he'd never seen me smile like I did when I was painting that morning. We were sitting in the sunroom by then, the late light spilling over the floor like it was blessing everything it touched, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking about who hadn't called or who still hadn't apologized. I was thinking about lemon trees, and summer roads, and the tiny list in my drawer labeled, "Someday." He asked if we could visit the coast in spring, and I said yes, before he even finished the sentence. Then I told him the house was almost ours, that the agent had called that morning, final paperwork was being drawn, and by next week, I'd be signing. His eyes widened, and he said, "So this'll be ours," and I said, "No. It'll be yours too." Because I'd already changed the deed. I'd already updated the will. I'd already told my lawyer exactly how much I wanted protected, from the family that thought silence could erase love, and from the woman who once said she'd rather I disappear than keep making them feel guilty. No more guilt. No more shrinking. No more watching birthdays pass like unopened mail. I wasn't doing it anymore. That weekend, we took photos in the garden, him holding the cat, me with my hands in the soil. No makeup, no filters, just sun and dirt and laughter. When he posted them, he tagged it, "building something real." And I knew he meant more than just a garden. The rest of the family didn't comment. Not one like. Not one message. Just silence, the kind they once used as a weapon. But now, it felt like peace. The kind of silence that comes when you've chosen yourself. Thought he told me he didn't sleep that night. That after he got home from the cafe, he stared at his bedroom ceiling for hours, trying to make sense of how adults could be so cruel. I wanted to tell him not all adults were like that, but he was smart, he'd seen enough. So instead, I just asked what he wanted to do next. He looked up at me and said, "Can I come with you? Wherever you go." I didn't hesitate. I told him yes. And that very night, I began moving pieces into place. I'd lived my life for other people far too long, for my late husband, for my son, for the image they all wanted me to uphold. But when I watched my grandson drag his little suitcase up my porch steps, I knew none of that mattered anymore. I called the school first, arranged for a transfer. Then I contacted a friend from years ago, someone with a quiet little cottage near the coast, the kind of place where no one asks questions. She still had the keys. And by the end of the week, we were gone. I left a letter, not for closure, but for documentation. I wrote exactly what had been said, what had been done, and what I was no longer willing to tolerate. No dramatic accusations. Just the truth. Clean, final, and permanent. They didn't deserve access to either of us. The silence that followed was confirmation enough. No apologies. No phone calls. Just the dull echo of absence, the kind they thought they'd wanted. Meanwhile, we planted herbs outside the kitchen window. We read together in the evenings. He picked up sketching, and I started writing again, nothing fancy, just letters I never planned to send. But they were mine. And slowly, the weight I didn't even know I was carrying started to lift. People think starting over is loud, dramatic, marked by some grand gesture. But they're wrong. Starting over is quiet. It's choosing different. Mugs in the morning. It's learning to smile without waiting for someone to cut it down. It's sitting across from someone who reminds you that even when the world turns its back, love, real love, can still find you, hold you, and stay. I didn't say a word when they walked through the door, laughing, already acting like they belonged. My son, his wife, two of the cousins, the same ones who hadn't called in months. They brought wine, flowers, gifts, loud, theatrical, as if the years hadn't happened. As if they hadn't vanished when I needed them most. But I didn't flinch. I let them sit, pour themselves drinks, pass the compliments, make little jabs about how quiet it is here, and how surprised they were to get my invitation. I didn't correct them. I never invited them. My grandson did. I saw it in his eyes, the way he kept glancing at me like he was waiting for me to tell them to leave. But I didn't. I waited. I let them fill the room with their noise, their stories, their false warmth, until the lawyer stepped in, holding the envelope. That's when everything shifted. Silence dropped like a curtain. I asked them to sit. Told them I had an announcement. And then I read the letter out loud. Every word. The new arrangements. The transfer of ownership. The clauses. The conditions. the full control handed to me and to him. My grandson. Their faces tightened, cracked, collapsed in on themselves. Like deflated balloons. My son stood up, furious, asking how I could do this without consulting the family. I just looked at him and said, I did. The part of it that showed up when it mattered. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth, but my grandson stood then, tall, calm, and said, You don't get to yell here. This isn't your house. Anymore. I didn't need to add anything. I simply stood beside him. And in that moment, I felt it. Not revenge. Not victory. Just peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to be included. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself. And the one person who never stopped seeing me, I'd chosen him too. As they left, fuming, I watched them go without a single tremble in my hands. Later that evening, my grandson and I sat on the porch, sipping tea, watching the light fade over the hills. He leaned over and said, You really meant it, didn't you? When you said we'd make our own plans. I nodded. We already have. That night, I slept without replaying old conversations. Without hoping for old apologies. I didn't need them anymore. They'd built a wall around me for years. I just stopped knocking. And the silence that followed? It sounded a lot like freedom. Thank you for staying with us through this emotional and powerful journey. Margaret's story reminded us that even after a lifetime of silence, dignity and justice can still find their voice. Thanks for watching my original story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe for more fictional narratives written and produced by me.